Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jonathan Wassling. I'm Director of the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Keele University. It's fantastic to have such a great audience here for our first lecture this year. The purpose of the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences and our Grand Challenges lectures is to ignite conversation right across the university and the wider community, to challenge areas of thinking in the ways in which our disciplines can contribute to understanding and tackling the demanding problems that our society faces today. And so it's very great pleasure that I welcome our first speaker of our series this year, Dr. Rowan Williams, who will be, I'm sure, a tremendous stimulus to that conversation here at the university and beyond. Dr. Williams will be giving the Hartshill Annual Lecture this evening, and Professor Joe Andrews, a Professor of Literature and Culture here at Keele, has worked hard with ILAS to include this additional lecture as part of Dr. Rowan Williams' visit to the area. So real special thanks to you, Joe, for making this event possible. For many of you, Rowan Williams will need little, if any, introduction. He's the former Archbishop of Canterbury, the 104th, I believe, appointed in 2002, and he served for 10 years until 2012. One thing's for certain is that Dr. Williams is no stranger to higher education. After his doctorate at Wadham College, Oxford, where he worked on the Russian Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky, Dr. Williams' career began as a lecturer at Muirfield College, Theological College from 1975 to 1977. Following his ordination as deacon in Ely Cathedral in 1977, he returned to Cambridge, where he studied as an undergraduate, and here he spent 9 years in academic work and parish work. In 1983, he was appointed as a lecturer in divinity in the university, and the following year became dean and chaplain of Clare College. For those of you who will be familiar with as Rowan Williams as the Archbishop of Canterbury, you may recall him on the television and elsewhere as being possibly quiet, mild-mannered, very academic, but there certainly is another side to him, and I didn't know this, that he's also a very significant activist. In fact, has even been arrested in the past as part of his activism. He was arrested for singing psalms, quote, as part of the CND protest at Alconbury in 1984. I'm not sure what the local constabulary objected to, whether it was your version of the Psalter or the pointing you were using or the particular psalm. I've no idea. But maybe we will hear a little more about that later. So no strangers to controversy, and clearly, as Archbishop, many other important things you've had to say in terms of your personal views and convictions in that area. In 1986, Dr. Williams returned to Oxford as Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity Canon at Christ Church, and in 1990 he was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy. In 2003, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and in 2010, a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales. Dr. Williams is an outstanding theological writer, scholar, and teacher. He has written extensively across a very wide range of related fields: philosophy, theology, especially early Christian patristic Christianity, spirituality, and religious aesthetics. However, he's also written on areas that will really resonate, I think, with us here at Keele, very much on moral, ethical, and social topics. Since becoming Archbishop, he turned his attention increasingly to contemporary cultural and interfaith issues, for which many of you will remember him very well. In addition to the universities Oxford and Cambridge, he's received honorary doctorates from universities from across the world, from Durham to Toronto, Belgium to Bonn. In 2013, following 10 years as Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Williams took up the Mastership of Magdalen College and was made a life peer, becoming Lord Williams of Oystermouth in the city and county of Swansea. His Grand Challenges lecture today is Ethics, Law and the Future of Democracy, where he will look at the evolution of our democracy and why and where it may be at risk today. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rowan Williams as our first lecturer in our series this year.
Thank you very much indeed for the welcome and introduction, and thank you all for being part of what I hope will be a conversation, not just a lecture. And I'm intending to leave as much time as I can for questions at the end of this. As you've heard, I have a continuing role in the House of Lords, and I happened to be there yesterday afternoon when the Leader of the House read out the Prime Minister's statement on the current situation regarding Brexit. Don't worry, this lecture will not be entirely about Brexit. And that, of course, takes us back to the question of what it means to use a referendum in the work of a modern democracy. We had a referendum on Europe, we had a referendum on Scottish independence a little before. And it can't have escaped your notice that there will be some people who regard the referendum as the highest point or the clearest expression of democracy. When people grumble about the outcome of the referendum, and some people do, there's very often a complaint that they are somehow resisting democracy, or, to use a rather chilling phrase, the will of the people. So why don't we decide everything by referendum? What does it mean to live not simply in a democracy, but in a representative democracy, where we use our vote not just to settle questions in the abstract, but to select people whose judgment we trust to make significant decisions? All of this, I think, ought to make us think rather harder than we regularly do about the meaning of the word democracy. And to put my argument before you as candidly as possible right at the start, one of my major worries about global politics at the moment is that we suffer from a huge confusion about the meaning of democracy and are facing a crisis of democratic government in country after country after country, our own included. So, part of my purpose in this brief reflection on our current political situation will have to do with this question. How are we defining democracy? What are the threats to it? What are the possibilities? What do we need for a working, healthy democracy? Democracy is a word with a rather disreputable history. For quite a long time, well up into the 19th century, people tended to assume that democracy just meant power exercised by the crowd or the mob. And it took a while for democracy to become respectable as an ideal. Looking back, it seems that what made it respectable was not just what it was positively, but what it wasn't. If in the 19th century you wanted to avoid autocratic monarchy, unaccountable oligarchy, or dictatorship, democracy was what you went for. Democracy was the rule of the people, in the sense that it was not the rule of an authority that wasn't responsible to anything but itself. The great step forward, you might say, in 18th century thinking, the age of the Enlightenment, was that challenges needed to be put to all kinds of authority that refused to be accountable in some sense, that refused to give some sort of argument for why anybody should take them seriously, any sort of argument for their legitimacy. And so we moved gradually but steadily through the 19th century towards an age we generally regard as the great age of democracy in the 20th century, when more and more countries developed representative institutions and limited the range of what could be done by unaccountable executive power. Government became answerable in a new way. We were allowed to ask more and more awkward questions of government, and we were allowed to put it to the test every so often in elections. The problem that came with this was that it became very easy for people to think democracy was, as it were, the natural state of things. And in the last 15 or 20 years, with some of our more adventurous interventions in other parts of the world, we have learned something of the risks of this. We've assumed that if you take away a dictatorship, what you get is a democracy. In other words, all you need to do, to take one obvious example, is to remove Colonel Gaddafi, and Libya becomes Switzerland in a couple of weeks. This has not happened. And why exactly that's such a seductive picture, and why exactly it won't work, and what we need to do to move around those problems, I think is one of the issues we face at the moment. But something similar comes through also in many of the arguments about our own constitution in the United Kingdom. So, for example, from time to time, people raise the question, very rightly and properly, what are we going to do about the House of Lords? It's an unelected body, and it's now a phenomenally large unelected body. Another thing you notice if you go into the chamber these days is you have to arrive earlier and earlier in order to get a seat, because 700-odd people don't actually fit into the chamber. And it's the largest legislative chamber, I believe, in Europe, if not in the world. When there were rather more serious arguments than there are now about the reform of the House of Lords, one of the arguments was, of course, the Lords don't have any democratic legitimacy. Nobody elects them. And that's an argument whose force rather depends on the idea that democracy is just a matter of popular support. What we may have lost sight of, and this is something I want to explore at greater length, is what you might call the ecology of a democracy. That's to say, what, in addition to a popular mandate, a popular electoral mandate, what do we need to make a democracy legitimate and functional? And the answer is, it seems, we don't just need votes. We need a somewhat more comprehensive picture of how decision-making works in a context where certainly the key decision-making body is answerable to the electorate, but the processes which inform, challenge, and shape the actual working of that decision-making body are much more diverse. So there's my first point. To work properly, democracy needs to be, I'll use the word again, a political ecology. That is to say, an environment with lots of different elements going on in it. If it weren't that, we would indeed be deciding everything by referendum or plebiscite. And we don't, because we know that there are areas of complex negotiation, areas of the dreaded word expertise, perspectives extending over a long possible future period, and many other considerations which don't allow of settlement just by majority vote. And what's more, a majority vote in itself doesn't tell you how to deal with the people who don't agree with it. In other words, a functional democracy needs to know how it's going to manage minorities. Now, behind that first point, I would say, lies a rather deeper question about democracy, why it matters, and why it's legitimate. And that's why my title has words like ethics and law in it. The only really good argument for democracy is that people in general, are the sort of things that ought to be allowed to make decisions about themselves, rather than have other things or people make decisions about them. The fundamental rationale of democracy, what makes it arguable, is that human beings are the kind of beings who deserve, in virtue of their humanity, the liberty to shape their circumstances. Take that argument away, and you really do have mob rule. So the legitimacy of democracy, the defensibility of democracy, on moral or philosophical grounds, depends on a particular view of human beings. We have that innate dignity which allows us to shape the circumstances we live in. But of course, if that's the case, the fact that you have the misfortune to have voted for the losing party or parties in an election doesn't strip you of that dignity. And a majority, therefore, in a functioning democracy, has a responsibility to cater for the human dignity, the interest, the well-being of a minority. That's, I think, the point at which the notion of law comes in. Democracy without law is majoritarian tyranny. Lawful democracy is a democracy in which the majority binds itself to recognize and cater for the interests of minorities, which may be minorities of diverse kinds. They may be ethnic minorities in a state, they may be simply the minority that have lost the election. But the principle which makes democracy a good idea is the principle that obliges the majority to look after the minority. That's why democracy cannot be identified simply with populism or what I call majoritarianism, the tyranny of the majority. To make sense of this, we need, therefore, not just a simple appeal to the will of the people. We need to have arguments that tell us why the people are worth listening to. That is, people in general, because the phrase "the people" is one, again, that ought to make us prick up our ears a little bit suspiciously, given the history of phrases like the will of the people in the 20th century. We need, in other words, an element of ethical, philosophical reflection in the background. So, perhaps there's my second point. We need, I said at the beginning, an ecology of democracy. We need a variety of institutions and elements. And second, we need that to be deployed in order to guarantee that a democratic government does not simply become the voice of an aggressive majority. But that leads on to my third point. It means that what a majority decides in a democracy is something that's always going to be open to argument and challenge. Or to put it another way, a democratic vote makes something lawful, but it doesn't necessarily make it right or sensible. And any attempt to say the people have spoken, the argument is over, wherever you stand on the political spectrum, that sort of argument ought to be anathema in a democracy. Because the point of a democracy is argument, dare I say. A good democracy is a quarrelsome democracy. I say that aware of the fact that both in the United States and here, levels of political polarization and violent language in political argument have reached what seem to be unprecedented levels. And to speak about a quarrelsome democracy does not mean an abusive democracy, or a democracy in which people are simply trying to shout each other down. But I would say a well-functioning democracy is one in which good and vigorous public argument about what is good for us corporately is not stifled. That distinction between what is lawful and what is right or sensible is a very hard one to get our heads around at times. Most of us, I think, when we've won an argument, would like to think, now I know I'm right. And that applies, of course, corporately as well as individually. But arguments don't stop. And it may be the case that a democratic process delivers a result which is, in the eyes of a substantial minority, morally challengeable. And that minority will want to go on arguing while recognizing the lawfulness of a situation, arguing that the law should be changed. But of course, this is still argument about law. It's not argument about force or coercion. A minority in a democracy can't simply stand up and say, well, I know we're a minority, but we're a right minority, and therefore we know what's true. Let me take an example from an obvious area of political and ethical discussion, which is by no means a dead issue in many parts of the world, as we well know. And it's the argument which many churches and other religious bodies have got involved in about abortion. In this country, abortion is legal. After a good deal of argument in the 1960s, legislation was passed allowing, under certain circumstances, pregnancies to be legally terminated. A very substantial percentage of the population, largely but not exclusively religious, and in that religious spectrum, largely but not exclusively Catholic, have said abortion may be lawful, but that does not compel us to believe that it is right. We would like it if the legislative situation were different. We shall go on arguing. And that argument is not yet dead. And there will be great differences within this room of approaches to and commitments on that subject. But it seems to me that that is a perfectly reasonable place to be. This decision is lawfully made. In process terms, it's unchallengeable. It doesn't make it right, but equally, the minority can't say, we know better than the mass of the population, therefore the mass of the population has to agree with us. The argument must go on. Arguments must be won. Votes must be won. A quarrelsome democracy is in action. To take another example of a rather different kind, the question of the licitness, the legality of the war with Iraq in the last decade is one about which argument was vigorous at the time and continues now. Was our military action in Iraq actually lawful? If lawful, was it right? If you accept it as lawful, can you still challenge its rightness? And so on. I hope you see what I mean, that the difference here is a significant one. You may accept a process, but also that process ought to give you the entree into another round of argument. Once you start appealing to the will of the people as having settled a question, well, most people agree with this, so it must be right, you have surrendered one fundamental principle of the democratic vision, which is that every voice deserves to be heard. And that principle, every voice deserves to be heard, is itself the key principle of democracy. Well, so far, what I've done is just put down 3 markers, as you might say, about what a good democracy needs. A variety of institutions, not just an electoral process delivering a majority, an attention to the needs, the voices, and so forth of minorities, so that everyone shares the same guarantee of security under a law which allows everyone the same redress, and a practice of ongoing public argument, intelligent public argument, which allows us to continue a process of political discernment, sifting and testing visions and proposals. If we are globally in a situation where democracy is somewhat in crisis, it has to do with the erosion of one or more of those 3 basics. It may have to do simply with the erosion of institutions. That's to say, the undermining of institutions which speak for some interest more than just the immediate political and electoral. I would say that a well-functioning society needs long-term institutions within it, above all connected with the practice of the law, which are not instantly vulnerable to the next electoral round. We need institutions, as I've often argued in the past decade or so, which keep certain issues firmly on the radar of the population, even when they're not particularly electorally attractive. The example I've frequently used there is the reform of our prison system. Nobody wins votes by arguing for the reform of the prison system, politically speaking, electorally speaking. Yet we have a massively costly, dysfunctional, and inhumane penal system in this country, expensive and inefficient. As a society, we need some institutions to keep that on our radar. A few years ago, I would have said that environmental issues were similar. You didn't win votes on environmental questions. I'm not sure that's quite so true now, but I think you'll see that the principle applies there as well. To the extent that it's still true that ecological questions don't get the priority they need and deserve in our public argument, we need bodies, communities of discourse in our society that keep that sort of question on the boil. And this is the point of having, in a good working democracy, institutions that are trusted to keep that sort of discussion going. A sensibly conceived upper chamber in Parliament, and the jury is a little bit out as to how sensibly conceived the House of Lords is, but a sensibly conceived upper chamber does that, which is why it probably needs something other than popular election for its composition. Universities do it. And of course, what's happening here today is precisely, if I may say so, what a university ought to be doing, keeping certain issues on the radar. And dare I say it, churches and other religious bodies, if they're doing their job, are also there in order to keep that longer view, that non-electoral set of perspectives alive. When you have a cultural or political environment in which institutions like this, an upper house, a judiciary, religious bodies, universities, are fairly systematically pushed aside or undermined or regarded as self-interested and irrelevant bodies, you actually have some real difficulties in maintaining what I called earlier a healthfully quarrelsome democracy. The more I think about this, the more it seems to me that one of our issues is that we are in a culture which has learned to be very suspicious of institutions, on the whole for quite good reasons. Lots of institutions in society, including universities and churches, I'm afraid, and doubtless including the judiciary and the House of Lords as well, have not had what you might call a sterling record. They've not always behaved as trustworthy bodies. And yet, a blanket cynicism about these institutions all too easily sells the pass to populism and majoritarianism. And I want to pose the question of how in a society we make our institutions, these sorts of institutions, more durable, more robust, more dependable. And to pick up a very painful and neuralgic subject for all of us in the church, the independent inquiry into child sex abuse in the church in the last year or so has, as never before, challenged the church as to whether it's prepared to be fully accountable for its mistakes, its oversights, and its abuses. The question is, how can it become more trustworthy? Many institutions, I think, face similar challenges, but that's different from a pervasive negativity or cynicism about institutions as such. Look across the Atlantic, and one of the alarming and fascinating things, one of many alarming and fascinating things you see in the White House, is a systematic attack on the institutions of American society. An independent press, an independent intelligence agency, an independent judiciary, one by one, are shot down in flames by an executive authority apparently uninterested in the ecology of democracy. That's the kind of thing we need to keep our eyes open for. When the executive power, appealing to the will of the people, a 51% vote or some such thing, when such a power overrides the natural variety, the interaction of what you might call ground-up institutions in society, democracy is in trouble. But that leads me to my final point. If all that I've said is true, then a healthfully working democracy requires, as part of its well-being, bodies, communities, traditions within it that have strong imaginative, spiritual, ethical commitments. And here's another paradox. My first paradox was that exactly the principle that justifies majority rule in democracy also justifies attention to minorities. My second paradox is that an argumentative democracy, where you're always debating the public good, needs communities that have very strong and fixed moral ideas and are prepared to argue about them, but are prepared to argue within the space of mutual respect and the acknowledgement of dignity. So if there is, and here's the self-interested bit really, if there is a role for religious communities in a democracy, as naturally I believe there is, I would say it's something to do with this. Something to do with keeping certain issues in focus that are very readily forgotten in a short-term, populist, often shallow public debate. And the challenge to a religious community such as my own is, can we, again, be credible, can we be worth listening to in our own expressed concerns about our social well-being, our political justice, our global responsibility? Can we have the kind of expertise, the kind of breadth of vision, and the kind of patience of involvement which makes us worth hearing in the argumentative democracy that I think we need? One of the great delights of the last few weeks has been not simply listening to some of what my successor has had to say about public questions, but listening to some of the public commentary on this, which tends to be along the lines of, when Archbishop Welby first succeeded in Canterbury, many of us were so relieved to have at last somebody who made sense rather than a remote and unintelligible academic with unreliable left-wing views. I'm paraphrasing what was often said a little bit more bluntly. But now he's gone native as well. Well, you may or may not agree with what Archbishop Welby has had to say about economics in recent weeks, but what strikes me is that he is doing what I think a church leader in these circumstances ought to be doing, keeping certain issues in focus that are very easily blurred or pushed to the margins in a narrow, short-term, and increasingly obsessively limited political discourse in this country. I think the very last thing I'd want to say on this occasion is that whether you voted Remain or Leave, you must surely have some concern about a political situation where one set of apparently intractable problems is currently occupying the entire political energy of a government, to the visible detriment of every other urgent issue in society. This cannot be the way to do it. And this is why, to be completely candid, I think a referendum is not a good idea. there are other ways of sorting out the discernment of a political community. And if you're going to have a referendum, you need to think very hard about the conditions under which it operates, what makes it valid, what makes it binding, what processes of, again, public discernment and argument go to making it work. And so that's where I want to leave us, with a vision, I hope, of a democracy that is not bound to the mythology of the will of the people as a simple majoritarian principle, that is willing to look at the range and interaction of institutions that make public decision-making work. A democracy which is hospitable to ethical voices and ethical traditions which may be unwelcome or difficult or angular or hard to accommodate, but are nonetheless part of what sharpen up public argument. Above all, a democracy which is committed to the rule of law in the sense that it continues to be absolutely, without qualification, bound to attend to the voice of every citizen on the basis of a clear commitment to human dignity. And if there's one other role that religious bodies ought to be committed to in such a context, I think it is the exploration and affirmation of what that human dignity is, what it entails, and perhaps just pushing back occasionally on the question of what do you think it's based on. But I'll leave you with that question, with thanks for your attention and looking forward to your comments.